Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed, Part 3, September Q&A. Tim's here. He is ready to go. Double thumbs up from Tim. Could not be more pumped.
Yeah, I'm pumped. I'm so pumped.
See? As advertised. But before we do, today's video is brought to you by Arctic and their return to the case market with the Xtender VG eATX mid-tower case featuring vertical GPU support. Designed to deliver maximum performance while still offering a visually impressive design, the Xtender VG is perfect for high-end builds that you want to show off. The panoramic glass panels perfectly showcase your hardware, while the pre-installed high-performance P12 and P14 Pro ARGB fans make sure it all stays cool. Inside, you can fit a pair of 420mm radiators and graphics cards as long as 360mm in either a vertical or horizontal configuration. The Xtender VG is available in white, black, and even a mirror black finish. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Alrighty, is right now a good time to be building a new PC from nothing? As you mentioned, the 7800X3D is well priced, and most of the new GPUs have decreased in price since their launch earlier this year. I think right now is probably as good a time as any without, you're always guessing here. It's always a gamble as when the best time to build is. But I think right now is a reasonable time. You don't have to buy a 7800X3D. There's some other, you can argue till you're black and blue on the face as to which platform you should invest in. I think we're both pretty firmly on the AM5 side of things at the moment. We think there's really no point investing in AM4. And then the Intel platforms, like Arrow Lake, no future there. There's going to be a refresh. So it's pretty hard to tell someone who's building a new system from scratch that they should buy, an LJ1851 motherboard with DDR5 memory, with one of the new Arrow Lake CPUs or newish Arrow Lake CPUs. And then whatever you build there, like the Core Ultra 7 265K, certainly quite a decent CPU, fast enough for gaming and all that sort of stuff for the most part. And a good productivity CPU, but then that's it. So the next true architectural upgrade from Intel will require you to not only buy a new CPU, but also a new motherboard. The memory you buy now should be fine, but yeah, if you're buying a decent motherboard, like you want Wi-Fi 7, all those sort of features, you're looking at least, I'd say, $200 US. So anyway, that's that, AM5. I think you agree with that?
Yep. Yeah, I think the only time better than now would be the usual sale periods, so like your Black Friday and Amazon Prime Day sort of things where a lot of components do go on sale. That said, the last couple of years of like Black Friday PC component sales have been pretty underwhelming. It's not like there's been massive discounts on CPUs and GPUs. GPUs in particular, you might be lucky to get like 5% off the normal price. So
it's probably worth checking out that we're so close at this point in time.
Yeah, that's true. It is probably worth waiting, especially for large purchases like an entire new PC. You'll certainly see deals on things like cases, power supplies, SSDs, the things that are sort of the higher margin type products. The lower margin stuff like graphics cards, again, hard to find sales, but it's probably unlikely that you'll see the worst prices during Black Friday.
Got to be careful saying lower margin. Where they don't need to sacrifice margins.
Well, yeah, that's right. So, yeah, obviously there are some GPUs that are above the MSRP still. RX 9070 XT is one of them. That could probably come down a bit in price. So if we do see the higher supply that we are expecting, that at least we've been told is supposed to be coming towards the end of this year, potentially that card will come down to its MSRP, making now not a great time to buy. But outside of that, most of the other models are at the MSRP, and then during Black Friday you might see some small discounts. So yeah, definitely a better time now than earlier in the year, where obviously graphics card pricing was insane, and then there was that whole period where you couldn't even buy a graphics card for a little while. They were anticipating a different launch time for the cards, and then there was no supply for a while. So
we're not expecting any new processors or GPU. No, we're not expecting anything to change this year. So whatever's sort of available now will be available at the end of the year.
Yep.
Black Friday and stuff, there might be some deals though. We're not expecting anything too crazy that you regret. And then next year, there'll be the GeForce Super Series refresh. No idea what is going to be on offer there in terms of price and performance.
Yeah.
And then I think Zen 6 and stuff like that'll be later in the year. I don't think it's worth waiting for that at this point in time. If you can get a 7800X3D for like $360 US or less, then that is a really great buy. or, whatever other CPUs. There's plenty of options there.
Yep. So we've got two sort of interrelated questions here that we'll get through. The first one is, RX 9000 cards were supposedly selling well, but they still don't appear on the Steam hardware reports months later. I know there was a bug with the survey that caused them to be detected as generic Radeon graphics. Is this still the cause, or is it just that NVIDIA sold that much more units of RTX 50? And the second question is, with the latest figures showing NVIDIA market share increasing to 94% for discrete graphics, do you still believe that AMD needs to play the game to compete? Also, how do you reconcile this with the claims by Steve's contacts and retailers that AMD is flying off shelves relative to NVIDIA? Are those just microcosms?
Okay, so I'll start with, first of all, I think AMD does need to play the game. That's been proven with this current generation. I would say, even ignoring sales figures, you just have to look at review reception and then just the general reception online. I think
they played the game and it helped them.
Yeah, people are annoyed that you can't buy a 9070 XT for $600 US, and rightfully so. But had they launched that part at $50 discount to the 5070 Ti, there'd be no interest in it. People are only annoyed because of how good it would be at that price. And the percentage relative to the GeForce competition that it's meant to be cheaper than, it still maintains that percentage in most markets, which is what's making it an attractive option and why people are interested in it to begin with. So I think playing the game is unfortunately a necessity. You can't have NVIDIA playing dirty, let's say, by saying a product's meant to be $750 US and then charging $900, and then AMD saying, well, we're only charging $700 and it's $700. That's just not going to work. So as for how do we reconcile claims that they're flying off shelves and stuff? Well, they are still flying off shelves. Now, is it a microcosm? Probably. We have a few different data points, some of them publicly available, that we can point to support the information we're being given here locally. And, some of the things that some people are upset about that I've said in the past, which were absolutely true, but they want to deny them being true, as one where I spoke to retailers leading up to the RDNA 4 launch, so the launch of the 9070 XT. And if you recall at the time, if you relive the history, this shouldn't be shocking to anyone, because you couldn't buy a 5070. You couldn't buy a 5080. These were unicorn products. I think it was major retailers in the US, Micro Center, was saying they got 6 in or something like that after waiting for a delivery. Yeah,
NVIDIA claimed that was because of demand, but then you speak to retailers and they were clearly saying it was a supply issue.
It's like a technical lie. There was extreme demand, no doubt about it. People really wanted 5090s and 5080s even at these inflated prices because they're brutally fast, or at least the 5090 is. But also, there was no supply. So this should be common knowledge at the time, or should have been. So when we spoke to retailers, and we spoke to a few different retailers, a few different regions around the world, and we had a few other people online, like Hardware Canucks validated this with their local contacts, that the claim was, when speaking to retailers, they said they had so many 9070 XTs in stock, which made sense because it was delayed by
3 months.
3 months.
Yep.
I was going to say 3 months.
Yep.
That's crazy. It was delayed by 3 months. They had 3 months of inventory building up without being able to sell them. And they had no Blackwell GPUs. So retailers told us if they were to sell everything they had in stock, 9070 XTs, if they sold all of those within the first few days, they would have officially sold more 9070 XTs than all Blackwell GPUs to date. And that happened. I spoke to the retailers and said, yeah, we've sold way more 9070 XTs than we have NVIDIA GPUs, because there were no NVIDIA GPUs. They were all being sold for AI, like professional grade stuff, not gaming stuff. So that actually happened. That is accurate history. That happened in the US, Canada, Australia. I think most regions that happened.
Yeah, that was around March, April of this year. Yeah.
And as we predicted, once that happened, you would see GeForce supply improve and then pricing would come down. That's what happened.
They launched some other products as well that were in stock at launch as well, like the 5060 Ti, which was always available largely. Yep.
So that absolutely happened. And to anyone paying attention, that shouldn't be a shock. And again, other media confirmed that when I tweeted out saying, yep, they've seen the same thing in their region. So that's part of the story. Now, since then, obviously, GeForce availability has improved. But I reached out just today, before we filmed this segment, to speak to a few different people who are absolutely in the know, and these are not fanboys, they do not care, they're simply selling graphics cards. They actually, a lot of them don't even care about the industry. They just care about selling the products. So here in Australia, major retailers, I got information, and again, I'm not going to list any retailers that speak to us and give us sales data and stuff like that, or percentages. But so one comparison I asked for was the 9070 XT versus the 5070 Ti. Very interesting comparison. Now, this retailer told me that in the last 6 months, they've sold just over 200% more 9070 XTs than 5070 Ti's. And the last 30 days, they've sold roughly double the Radeon GPU. So 9070 XTs over 5070 Ti's. So here in Australia, speaking around with a few different people, 9070 XTs have heavily outsold 5070 Ti's. And I have some other data that we can cross-reference this with in a moment, but I think this is really interesting stuff, that sort of behind-the-scenes stuff that I got to share with you guys. To date, the Australian retailers have sold twice as many, so 100% more 9060 XT series GPUs than they have 5060 Ti's. So that's another relevant head-to-head comparison. So 9060 XTs have been way more popular than 5060 Ti's here in Australia. And then the 9070 versus 5070 comparison, they said it's a little bit more wishy-washy because they use the 5070 in a lot of like system integration stuff. But even taking that into account, they've sold 70% more 9070s than non-XTs over the 5070. But in the last 3 months, they noted that the 5070s have started to come back. So in the last 30 days, for example, the 9070 has sold only 20% better. But that's still the Radeon GPU selling 20% more volume. So that's pretty surprising. But they expect the 9070 to pick up again because probably in the next month, it's going to see a price decrease here in Australia, dipping below $1,000 for the first time, Australian dollars. So 9070 XTs could become popular there. And then I asked around to find out, I wanted to know, look, since release of each model, so not in a select time period, just since day one for each model, because Blackwell's obviously been available, or some of the Blackwell GPUs have been available for longer. So they've had more time out in the wild to generate more sales. But as we noted at the start of this, the head start was essentially useless because they sold next to nothing because there was no supply. So to date, we've seen the GeForce 50 series have 56% of the share. So although they're getting smashed in those relevant matchups, they have many more models. So 56% of sales here in Australia, comparing those two product lines, 56% to GeForce 50, leaving 44% to Radeon 9000. So that was interesting, but they also said that stat could be a little bit misleading when talking about overall sales because they're still selling previous generation GPUs, and that's where NVIDIA did much better. So NVIDIA smashed AMD for the previous generation. GeForce 40 series in Australia, much more popular. So if we take from all of the GPUs sold in the last, since the release of the first GeForce 50 series GPU, and there's a lot of RTX 4060 and 4060 Ti's that have been sold up until basically now.
Because the 4060 was available, like that was the current model up until the 5060.
That's
right.
right.
There was many months that was still a quote-unquote new.
So in this
GPU.
sample of data, a lot of GeForce 40 series cards were sold, which sees NVIDIA owning 70% of all GPU sales, and then 30% basically to AMD, which is better than the global data that's been released for sure.
We can get into where the 94% thing comes up, but I think you've got some data from other sources that's sort of pretty similar, right?
Tech Epiphany on X, who also has a YouTube channel, has been keeping people up to date with the Mind Factory, so a large German retailer, with data here. So in the I think week 33 is the most recent update.
Mm-hmm.
And week 33 saw 44% of all GPU sales. This is just all of them. No specific lineups. Just GeForce branding was 44%, with Radeon at 55%, Arc at 1%. So that's even more skewed than the data we're getting here in Australia. It's sort of flipped on its head. And the most popular model sold in week 33 was the 9070 XT. 685 units were sold, which accounts for 27% of all sales. The 9060 XT doesn't specify the VRAM capacity, though they were saying basically no 8GB models were sold, and that's the same information we got here in Australia. That was the second most popular with 370 units, so 14.6%. Then the most popular GeForce GPU was the RTX 5070 Ti with 320 units, 12%. Then you got the 5080, 5060 Ti, 5070, 7800 XT. But basically, the only two RDNA, well, there's the 9070, isn't there? So that was only accounted for 1%, 1.2%. Yeah. But basically, the 9070 XT and then the 9060 XT series, that'll be mostly the 16GB model, dominated. So they accounted for nearly half of all GPU sales for that week.
So how do we reconcile that with the Steam hardware survey and the 94% of the total desktop market share? Well, there's many different reasons for this. Obviously, one of the reasons is potentially it's wrong, which I guess we'll get to. I think there's, with the whole, like I think it's from John Petty Research, right?
That's right.
The claim of 94% being NVIDIA GPUs. There's many different ways you can measure market share. So they could be talking about the entire discrete market, which would include your like AI system integrated systems, pre-built laptops that use discrete graphics, all go into that. Or it could be the AIB GPUs themselves, the DIY market. And it could also mean things like, is it shipments, which means, you know, the AIB is shipping it to retailers, not necessarily the actual sales, because shipments and sales are different. Then there's also things like, is it the market share as in the ownership levels of all cards worldwide, or is it the sales just from this year or from this generation? So that's why you often see those numbers vary from the different research houses. They will measure things in different ways. You often see Intel having quite a high GPU market share because some of these research firms count iGPUs, and obviously Intel sells a lot of CPUs, a lot of iGPUs in those CPUs. But I think with John Petty, they're talking about shipments with discrete graphics. Mm-hmm. So that is going to include not just the DIY market, which is obviously Mind Factory retailers in Australia that we've been talking to, but will also be your discrete laptop graphics where NVIDIA has effectively 100% market share. And with system integrator models, your pre-built Dell, HP, where NVIDIA has an extremely high market share. Mm-hmm. So there's those two things to factor in. And then whenever we've talked to AIBs at trade shows like Computex, they consistently tell us that specifically in Asian markets, such as China and Korea, GeForce is by far the most dominant brand. In places like China, Radeon is almost irrelevant. Same with Korea. The GeForce market share is extremely high. And you'll even see things like unusually high Intel CPU market share and DIY sales in those regions as well, because brand power has a much more significant play in the market there. So yeah, we've heard from some AIBs very high levels of sales for GeForce cards relative to Radeon, and that's because of the global scale of things. So while we can say, the market share is maybe 70% to NVIDIA, you look at a place like China, it'll be easily above 95% towards NVIDIA, and that's going to affect the numbers. That still doesn't seem to explain why it would be as high as something like 94% globally for sales. And especially why they're claiming that AMD's market share has decreased when RDNA 4 has clearly been much more popular and successful than RDNA 3. All of the numbers that we're seeing, the interest worldwide, not just in Australia and places like Germany, worldwide, is pointing to RDNA 4 selling more models than RDNA 3, which would mean that theoretically the market share should increase in favor of AMD. Maybe not to 70-30, but not the other way, making NVIDIA more popular. So that is confusing. If I had to guess what the market share actually is worldwide, I would think it's probably something like 80-20 if you factor in all sales of all models for the last year worldwide, China, Korea, the US. The US has been a little less favorable than Australia as well, because models like the 9070 XT have been worse priced than here. Here, the 9070 XT and 9060 XT have been quite attractive compared to GeForce models.
Yeah, much
Same in
cheaper.
Germany, where it's been much more achievable to get those cards at the MSRP. In the US, it's only happened more recently, and still today, the 9070 XT is a bit too expensive. But if I'm thinking worldwide and I'm factoring in AIBs and laptops and all those sorts of things, I think somewhere around 80-20 is probably at where I would peg it. So that's just my guess, but
it's a guess.
Why the numbers are like that, I'm not sure. The Steam hardware survey is also interesting because, that counts obviously global sales of like global market share of everything. It includes, laptops. It doesn't include just sales from right now. It includes everything that everyone owns. It includes all your internet cafes, which are not really a thing in Australia, but are a major thing in some Asian countries, which predominantly use GeForce GPUs. That seems to be a reason there. Obviously, there's the randomness of the survey as well. Not everyone is apparently polled in these things.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you just have to use a bit of common sense, a bit of logic. Like, whenever Radeon sales haven't been great, what's AMD's quick reaction to that?
Just to dump pricing through the floor.
And they haven't done that. So they've stayed again at the ratios that they sort of advertised at the MSRP. So, people say to us, why aren't we hammering AMD more for not meeting the MSRP? Well, we've already dedicated content to that. But we recognize they're playing the game. So they're maintaining the percentages they advertised essentially to the GeForce GPUs.
And it does depend on the region quite a bit.
Does depend on the region. But again, if they were seeing RDNA 3-like sales, then yeah, they'd be at the MSRP. They'd probably be below the MSRP. But when we speak to their exclusive partners, they tell us this has been a major success for them. The demand has been well beyond their wildest dreams. They're really happy with what they're seeing, and they're glad that AMD is finally playing the game because they're actually able to sell products, and it's much improved. So I think all of that's true. I think they claim to be making more of these than they've made before, and they're selling them faster. So I think everything's going well there. As for the market share stuff, I mean, we don't really care about that. We really care about the products themselves. It's up to AMD to work out the market share thing.
Yeah, and the market share, like I said, it's measured in different ways between different research firms. Also, ultimately, doesn't really matter for gamers. Like, I know it's like a kind of a war thing, right? Like, people want their team to win, but ultimately, yeah, it doesn't really matter. And yeah, like a lot of the evidence you can see, like I know AMD and their partners claim that RDNA 4 has been much more successful, but in their actual financial reports, the gaming division has increased substantially in revenue. And that is not something they can just mislead and lie on. They have to actually make those things accurate. And so, yeah, GeForce is obviously still, their gaming division, they claim many billions more than AMD's gaming division. And obviously AMD's gaming division includes things like console sales and that side of things. Obviously Nvidia's does now as well with, they've got some consoles like the new Switch 2 that would have launched during that period. But basically what I'm saying is that, you look at the revenue, the difference in things like revenue and sales for AMD's revenue in gaming was like virtually zero a couple of quarters ago. Like they were earning in the low hundreds of millions, which is effectively zero for a company the size of AMD with what they're currently doing in revenue. And now, the gaming division is increased substantially, whereas Nvidia's, I think, is increased as well, but not by that sort of percentage level where you can sort of quantify and go, yeah, obviously no one was interested in RDNA 3 products, and now people are interested in RDNA 4, and you're seeing the results in the financial reports and sales and interest. So,
well, I can't believe that here in Australia they're selling 200% more. Like, that's insane.
The 5070 Ti price here is very bad.
But the ratio is where it's meant to be, though.
It is. I think both cards
are
like,
what, 30% more expensive?
Yeah. The MSRP for the 5070 Ti in Australia is not good. Like, it's 1,500 Australian. That doesn't make any sense.
But, I mean, that data sounds insane, but then you look over at somewhere like Mine Factory where they have publicly available data, and that's even more extreme.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I guess with things like the Steam survey, often you need to reach a threshold of sales to be, or at least threshold for that model to be seen in the charts. Otherwise, it's just listed as other or included in some other metric. So we could sit here and say, yeah, the sales of these products, obviously all the data is suggesting it's much more popular. It could be from a tiny level to a sort of slightly higher level, and that's why it's not registering in a thing like the Steam Hardware Survey just yet.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's hard to say because we don't really have like a transparent look into exactly how they're counting those things. Like what, as the question alluded to, was there this bug with how they're counted? First of all, it doesn't actually matter. So
no,
it doesn't really matter. But like, was that a thing? That was the first I've heard of that. So I'm just going off what the question asker is sort of saying. But like, there's always been the talk of, how are they sampling the market and stuff. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, is that number accurate? I'm not sure, but also should you care? And I think the answer is no, you shouldn't actually care all that much.
No.
It's, are there good products for you to buy? That's the thing that makes, we want competition. Are there good products for people to buy? That's what matters.
Mm-hmm. Is the problem of poorly performing UE5 games the engine itself, the devs, or a mixture of both? I have no real insight into this other than, having benchmarked the games and tested them and got a sense of where things are heading. I think it's probably, my opinion, a mixture of both.
Yeah.
I've obviously never made a game with UE5, so no insight into how that process and how all that works out. But I have heard that it's, while a very powerful game engine that you can do a lot of things with, it is extremely complex as well. And I think with anything that's very complex, when you try to make it, I think of like website builders, right? When you try and make them really simple. So I don't want to say anyone because I'm making game developers sound like idiots when they're not. But when you want to try and make it more user-friendly and risk dumbing it down a bit, you sort of remove some of how powerful it can be or how well optimized it can be.
Yeah, you have to abstract it a bit.
Yeah.
That causes compromises.
Yeah, and as far as I can tell, there is a fair bit of that going on. And to really optimize it and get it to a good level, you need years of experience doing just that, which, game developers don't necessarily have years of experience working with the Unreal 5 engine. So I think that's why it's probably a mixture of both. Like the engine could do things better or be easier to optimize for. But again, I'm not really talking from a point of experience here, so my opinion on this is pretty well worthless. Just the truth of the matter. Like,
that is true.
I benchmark games using it, so I get a sense of like whether that's a good example of a game using the engine or not. But as far as the back end stuff goes and the software development, got very little insight. I've just heard from some game developers that have talked publicly about it and the challenges.
Yeah, there seems to be some things that are more inherent to how the engine works that developers have not been able to overcome. So like traversal stutter seems to be an issue in the majority of Unreal Engine 5 games and even, prior Unreal Engine titles that started to become an issue sort of the end of the Unreal Engine 4 era as games started to do more. And so when you see a widespread issue across most titles that use the same engine, that probably indicates it's more likely to be an engine issue. Because there are some pretty high-profile titles that use this engine that are otherwise reasonable, but just have that issue in it. But then on the other side of the scale, obviously Borderlands 4 is sort of a more recent example of an Unreal Engine 5 game that is quote-unquote unoptimized, obviously runs poorly even on low-quality settings. I don't necessarily think that's like Unreal Engine 5's fault that game runs like that. I think there was some development choices made, potentially not as much optimization put in, and then just the long development cycle of games these days.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about, let's say, the Unreal Engine 3 era, games were made in just a couple of years, so they had much more insight into the hardware people would have. They're not doing as much in the game, so there's less that needs to be done to optimize. There's not as many features that they're trying to cover, and so they can pretty easily predict and guess how the game's going to run on the hardware that it's been designed for. But a game like Borderlands, which was in development for, at least 5 years, they're thinking back in like 2020, what are people going to be playing this game on in 5 years? And I think we would have all predicted a very different GPU market and GPU situation for PC gamers than what was the reality. And so that's a real challenge for game developers. And so if you don't have an optimization focused process for game development and you're just guessing hardware's going to be like this in 5 years, let's target that, and then you're wrong, and you haven't done any optimization work, you end up with a title that performs poorly on the hardware of its time. So, yeah, I mean, how many years now have we been talking about PC game optimization? It's obviously always going to be an issue. There are always going to be games that could have had more optimization work put in, could run better, could look better for the performance. But I think, yeah, it's sort of the things you've been talking about. It's a combination of the challenges that are required to run a game of that scale, and also all the features that the engine has. It can do so many things: nanite, lumen, hardware accelerated ray tracing. You can add path tracing to it. You can add upscalers and frame generation. You can add all these different things. Game developers are doing custom things, and a lot of game developers used to use their own custom engines that they probably had years of experience built up. All these developers that had, the technical knowledge on their engines, moving to something like Unreal Engine, they have to reskill, relearn how to use that engine and all of its, nuances, which is a complicated process, even for experts in the industry. And all of those things play into Unreal Engine 5 having issues, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I know this isn't like a gotcha or a thing to point to sort of prove one way or the other, but like Fortnite, for example, uses the Unreal 5 engine, and it's a pretty big map, like the Battle Royale map. I'm not saying it's as big as, some of the games we're talking about, but it's still a big map. And there are, basically, when you play that game, there is sort of shader compilation stutter for the first few matches when you play it for the first time, because it doesn't have a shader loading thing.
Yeah.
But once you get past that, you don't really have, well, at least in my experience, any stuttering in the game, virtually zero. Once that's done, the game plays really well. And there's bugs that sometimes see you slingshot from one side of the map to the other, which is thousands of meters. And there's no compilation stutter or traversal stutter when that occurs. And even that game has pretty quick movement. Like, you can get from one side of the map to the other quite quickly.
It scales very impressively as well between the highest settings, which use nanite and lumen, right? And you can scale it all the way down to effectively potato quality, which is certainly not the case in a lot of other Unreal Engine 5 games. So I guess there is an example you can point to in saying, that's a game made by Epic, who also make the game engine.
Have a lot of insight into it, obviously.
A lot of insight, a lot of engineers. They obviously spent a lot of money on it because it's an extremely popular title, and they're constantly revising it. And so there is an example that you can look at of an Unreal Engine 5 game that actually seems to work quite well. And so it must be theoretically possible, right?
Yeah, again, I'm not saying, I don't want to upset some people in the comments and say it's exactly the same thing, but it is it's on a big map.
It's a challenging game. You've got 100 players, open world sort of style.
And you can traverse one side of the map to the other map quite quickly using different methods. And when doing so, you don't have any stuttering. Like, you can slingshot yourself from one side of the map to the other map when there's certain bugs in the game. And there's, no stuttering or anything to speak of. You just boom there at 300 frames per second. You arrive at your destination and you're in a completely new area, environment, and you just, there's no stuttering. You can continue to play at 300 frames per second, depending on your quality settings.
I wonder how much of that is because Fortnite, what version of Unreal Engine are they using? I imagine they're quite commonly upgrading to the latest point revision, 5.5, 5.6.
They do update it constantly.
Whereas a lot of the games that we're seeing today seem to be designed on a much older version of Unreal Engine than is the current version. And I'm not saying that game developers should be going out and mid-development cycle radically overhauling the engine and running updates, because that can cause all sorts of problems that aren't just fixes for things. It can break things as well, and that's why I'm not saying developers should be doing that. There's obviously reasons they don't, but with long development cycles, you could be having Unreal Engine 5.1 or 5.0 titles being released today, whereas a title that's only in development for a couple of years or gets frequent major updates like Fortnite is on a more recent version. Because, Unreal Engine, they are attempting to fix some of the things that people have been talking about, like traversal stutter. They're making these improvements. HDR was broken in the early versions of Unreal Engine. That's apparently been fixed in more recent versions. So, as these developers have to struggle through long development cycles with low resources, they're always, saying, we need more money to make these games, to polish it. They rush out some titles. You're going to see some problems. And, ideally we'd like things to be better and more optimized than they are. But unfortunately with Unreal Engine, there just seems to be this pattern. But you never know. 'Cause people bring up engines like Frostbite, for example, that's used for Battlefield, or in-house engines used for Cyberpunk. But we don't really know as well, like, how would that go if that engine was sold to the general public to be used? Like, would the in-house version, like the in-house games from EA running Frostbite, perform way better than some random developer getting their hands on it?
Well, the reason why those in-house engines work well when they work well is because they have in-house experts that know how to get the most out of it.
Yeah, that's right. So, is Unreal Engine sort of, in a way, suffering from how many games there are that use it, whereas those in-house engines, they're always obviously highly technical, highly, lots of expertise, as you were saying, but if they were more broadly used, would we also be seeing similar problems?
Surely.
There was talk in the days of when EA moved from Frostbite being just the engine that was used for the Battlefield titles to being used for also things like the Dragon Age series and other games, that internally they were struggling with it quite a lot because the engine itself was very complicated, and the tools that they'd built didn't necessarily support the development of like open world role-playing games. It was designed for shooters. And so they had to build out all these tools and get the expertise into to make those sort of systems work. And that was a very complicated process that took a lot of time. So if they were selling that multiplayer shooter engine to people and then suddenly they try to use it for all sorts of other games, maybe you'd see problems as well. So anyway, that's just sort of our thoughts on the state of Unreal Engine, I guess. But over time, hopefully they'll improve it.
And that concludes. There's no part 4. So, or is there? No, there's not. No, there's not. There's no part 4. We could do a part 4 sometime, though. That'd be pretty funny. Would it?
Don't know.
I've lost all sense of humor. I
don't think it is.
I don't get out enough to know.
Yeah.
So you've been getting out a bit. Let us know.
I'm going to go with not funny.
Damn. All right. Well, anyway, I'll might have to venture out and work on that one. Anyway, that is the end of part 3. It was good to have Tim back for this series. We had a lot of fun answering your questions. And yeah, hopefully in the not too distant future, things can get a bit more exciting in this industry, and that will make the Q&As even more fun, if you could imagine such a thing. Anyway, that is going to do it for the series and this video. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness, we have the join button or Patreon. Either one of those things will give you access to exclusive content, behind the scenes stuff, which is the exclusive content. So I sort of said that twice. There's a live stream, Discord server, and the Q&A stuff, which we're kind of doing right now. Anyway, check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. As always, Tim will hold it against you. I'm fine with it though, so not a problem on my end, which is the most important thing. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
Thanks for watching.